Later today, the Senate will vote to confirm Kash Patel to be director of the FBI. Mr. Patel will lead the nation's primary federal law enforcement agency at a critical time. We've seen a heightened threat of terrorism in the homeland. Illegal drugs continue to come across the southern border and take the lives of too many Americans. Violent crime spiked in recent years, and it's still a problem in many parts of the country. And at the same time, the FBI has lost the trust of many Americans who fear the agency has become politicized. Mr. President, Kash Patel has spent his career working in criminal law and national security. He spent his first 8 years after law school as a public defender in state and federal courts in Florida. In 2014, he was brought on as a terrorism prosecutor at the U.S. Department of Justice, prosecuting terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab. From there, he went to work in national security for the House Intelligence Committee and then in the first Trump administration. He worked on the National Security Council, where he handled hostage rescues, among other sensitive missions. He also served as principal deputy for the acting director of national intelligence and later as chief of staff for the acting secretary of defense. Mr. President, as I said, the FBI has lost trust among the American people in recent years. Much of that much of that stems from a perception that politics has infected the FBI's important work. And it's not hard to see why. In just the last few years, the FBI field office in Richmond, Virginia, circulated a memo suggesting that traditional Catholics could be violent extremists. In 2021, the Attorney General infamously instructed the FBI to work with local law enforcement to target parents who attended school board meetings. And of course, there is the FBI's apparent double standard when it comes to investigating President Trump and its repeated failures to cooperate with congressional Republicans. Mr. President, the next director of the FBI needs to focus on rooting out politics so the FBI can enforce the law, uphold the Constitution, and keep Americans safe. The Bureau also needs a renewed focus on empowering the FBI's field office to be good partners to local law enforcement. I'm encouraged that Mr. Patel has the support of the National Police Association, the National Sheriff's Association, and multiple state attorneys general, all of whom will be his partners in law enforcement should Mr. Patel be confirmed. We've unfortunately seen that no community is immune from crime, terrorism, or illegal drugs. And we need all law enforcement working together and focused on the real threats facing our country. I look forward to working with Mr. Patel to restore the integrity of the FBI and get it focused on its critical mission. Mr. President, one of the most significant accomplishments of the first Trump administration was the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. This comprehensive bill reduced tax rates for every income bracket, doubled the child tax credit, nearly doubled the standard exemption, or I should say the standard deduction, and enacted pro-growth policies for American businesses of all sizes. And what were the results? A growing economy, higher paychecks for hardworking families, millions of new jobs, small business growth, higher than expected federal revenues. That's right, higher than expected. Government revenues since the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act have exceeded projections by roughly $500 billion. An end to corporate inversions, which is the practice of moving U.S. company operations overseas for tax purposes. Practically every aspect of the U.S. economy was strengthened by this pro-growth legislation. And contrary to what my friends across the aisle like to claim, it was middle-class families, not wealthy Americans, who received the largest proportional benefit of the tax cuts. Now, let me just repeat that, Mr. President. It was middle-class families, not wealthy Americans, who received the largest proportional benefit of the tax cuts. Working families benefited from this legislation. Working families ended up with more money in their pockets. Working families had more breathing room because of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Anyone who pretends that this wasn't the case is either ignorant of the law or being deliberately deceptive. Mr. President, the income tax cuts for individuals are expiring at the end of this year, along with a key small business tax cut called the Section 199A pass-through deduction. And none of our top priorities for this year, or I should say one of our top priorities for this year, is extending this tax relief. But not just extending it, Mr. President, making it permanent. As I and several other Finance Committee Republicans noted last week in a letter on this subject, and I quote, "A temporary extension of these pro-growth and pro-family policies is a missed opportunity. Businesses need certainty while investing in their companies, and taxpayers should not fear tax hikes due to congressional inaction," end quote. That's it in a nutshell, Mr. President. Hardworking Americans shouldn't have to live in fear of a tax hike every few years. And businesses need a clear picture of the tax outlook so that they can plan for the long term. Mr. President, making the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent would protect hardworking families from uncertainty and ensure that they can keep more money in their pockets. And it would have significant long-term economic benefits. The National Federation of Independent Business reports that making the Small Business Section 199A deduction permanent would result in the creation of an additional 1.2 million jobs annually, with that number climbing as the law goes on. And the Tax Foundation reports that long-run gross domestic product would increase by a substantial 1.1%. The President has called for making the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent, and I'm committed to ensuring that any tax bill we consider does exactly that. We have a real opportunity to improve the lives of Americans both here and now and for the long term, and we can't waste it. Mr. President, needless to say, drafting major tax legislation takes time. And Senator Crapo, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, has been doing an incredible job laying the groundwork for a permanent Tax Cuts and Jobs Act extension. But there's still substantial work left to do to arrive at a bicameral agreement. And we have to take the time to get it and do it right. As we continue to move full steam ahead on this key part of the President's agenda, however, there are other pressing priorities that need to be addressed immediately. When the President's border czar was here last week, he emphasized that the administration cannot sustain its effort to deport criminals here illegally without additional funding. And the last thing we want is to delay other parts of the President's agenda, like border security, while we do the work needed to arrive at a tax agreement that can pass both houses of Congress. That's why the Senate is moving forward on a two-part legislative plan to accomplish our and the President's top priorities. The first bill we consider will address immediate needs like securing the border and other key national security priorities. The second will focus on making tax relief permanent. The budget resolution we are taking up this week will address the border security part of the equation. And then we will take up a second budget resolution for the tax portion. I want to thank Chairman Graham for doing the work to get today's resolution to the floor, and I look forward to passing it later this week. Mr. President, I look forward to taking up that second budget resolution as well in the not-too-distant future to prevent a $4 trillion tax hike on hardworking Americans and making the individual and small business tax relief from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the mandatory quorum call with respect to the Patel nomination be waived.
Is there objection? Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Kash Patel of Nevada to be Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Kash Patel of Nevada to be Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Justice. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kim. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McCormick. Mr. Merkley. Mrs. Moody. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moreno. Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Fisher, Justice, Marshall, Moran, Mullen, Rounds, Sheehy, Thune, Tuberville, Wicker. Senators voting in the negative: Blunt, Rochester, Cantwell, Kane, Kelly, Kim, Murray, and Warnock. Ms. Also Brooks. Ms. Also Brooks, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. McCormick. Mr. McCormick, aye. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz. No. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines. Aye.
Haven't heard that.
Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed. No. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan. No. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn. Aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan. No. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen. No. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Gallego. No. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden. No. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Aye. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders. No. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Curtis. Aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott of Florida. Aye. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks. Aye. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren.
Hey, Tony.
No. Mr. Haggerty. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, no. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, no. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Slotkin, no. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mrs. Moody. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King, no. Mr. Lankford. Mr. Lankford, aye. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mrs. Britt. Mrs. Britt, aye. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Moreno. Mr. Moreno, aye. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, aye. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, no. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schmidt, aye. Mr. Husted. Mr. Husted, aye. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Padilla, no. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, no. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy,
Yeah, oh, I'm totally.
aye.
And I need to make sure that I don't.
Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, no. Ms. Lummis. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar. No. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Gillibrand. Mr. Gillibrand, no. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye.
We have 51 yeas, 47 nays. The motion is agreed to. Clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Justice, Kash Patel of Nevada to be Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Mr. President.
Senator from Kentucky.
I've never liked calling too much attention to today's date, February 20th. But I figured my birthday would be as good a day as any to share with our colleagues a decision I made last year. During my time in the Senate, I've only really answered to two constituencies: the Republican Conference and the people of Kentucky. Over the years, the first group trusted me to coordinate campaigns, to count votes, to steer committees, to take the majority, and on 9 occasions, to lead our conference. Serving as a Republican leader was a rare and, yes, rather specific childhood dream. And just about a year ago, I thanked my colleagues for their confidence, which allowed me to fulfill it. To the distinguished members of this body, I've had the privilege to lead, and I remain deeply, deeply grateful. Today, however, it's appropriate for me to speak about an even deeper allegiance and even longer-standing gratitude. 7 times, my fellow Kentuckians have sent me to the Senate. Every day in between, I've been humbled by the trust they placed in me to do their business right here. Representing our Commonwealth has been the honor of a lifetime. I will not seek this honor an 8th time. My current term in the Senate will be my last. I've been a student of history my entire life. I can't remember the last time I didn't have a stack of biographies or political memoirs on my nightstand. And I know well how tempting it can be to read history with a sense of determinism, assuming that somehow notorious failures were inevitable, that crowning triumphs were predestined, and in either case, that lives and careers followed orderly paths. This, of course, isn't how things work. And I've never had to look further than my own life to recognize it. I've never lost sight of the fact that without my mother's devoted care, a childhood encounter with polio could have turned out a lot worse. That unless my father had taken a job in the bluegrass state, my interest in politics might have run a course somewhere else. But if it weren't for an 11th hour outside the box idea on the campaign trail, my Senate career would have been over before it began. Or that, if not for the people of Kentucky, time and again, agreeing that leadership delivers and electing me to send back here, it would have been someone else from somewhere else taking that seat at the table where I've had a chance to work, strategize, fight, and win. I grew up reading about the greatness of Henry Clay, but there were times when the prospect of etching my name into his desk in this chamber felt like more of a long shot than making it to the major leagues. I got a front row seat to the greatness of Senator John Sherman Cooper of Kentucky as a summer intern in his office. But at so many moments in my early career, the idea of following in his footsteps felt more distant than the moon. So the only appropriate thing to take away today, apart from a healthy dose of pride, is my immense gratitude for the opportunity to take part in the consequential business of the Senate and the nation. Gratitude to the people I represent, Kentucky's families and farmers and miners and service members and small business owners. Gratitude to loyal friends, dedicated volunteers, and talented staff who've helped me serve much better. Gratitude to this institution that has repaid my devotion so generously over the years, and to so many colleagues who've become great friends. Gratitude for my family's support. And in particular, my ultimate teammate and confidant of the last 32 years. Elaine's leadership and wise counsel, in their own right, have made her the most seasoned cabinet official in modern history. On top of all that, her devotion to me and to Kentucky is a lot more than I deserve. When I arrived at this chamber, I wasn't coming with a governor's statewide executive experience or a House member's appreciation for Washington dynamics. I knew my hometown of Louisville, and I'd spent the previous few years working hard to learn what mattered to folks all across the rest of the Commonwealth. And yet, within weeks of swearing the oath, sure enough, I was here on the floor talking with colleagues from other far-flung corners of the country, discussing solutions to a farm income crisis and infrastructure challenge that affected different states in the same way. I learned quickly that delivering for Kentucky meant finding the ways the Commonwealth's challenges were actually tied to national debates. Seeing to it that major agriculture legislation remembered Kentucky farmers and particularly included when they needed extraordinary assistance, like the tobacco buyout. Making sure that nationwide steps on transportation infrastructure included resources for modernizing the Brent Spence Bridge, which supports billions of dollars in economic activity in Kentucky and the surrounding region. And with the trust of a local community, finishing the task first assigned by President Reagan, the safe destruction of America's legacy chemical weapons, at the Bluegrass Army Depot. So efforts like these have spanned the length of my Senate career. And I've been humbled each and every opportunity to help Kentucky punch above its weight. Of course, the Senate has to grapple with foundational questions that reach even more broadly across American life and either further into posterity. We're trusted on behalf of the American people to participate in the appointment of the federal judiciary, to be the final check on the assembly of power in the courts beyond the reach of representative politics, and to ensure that the men and women who preside over them profess authentic devotion to the rule of law above all else. When members of this body ignore, discount, or pervert this fundamental duty, they do so not just at the peril of the Senate, but of the whole nation. The weight of our power to advise and consent has never been lost on me, and I've been honored to perform my role in confirming judges who understand their role. On this floor, there is no place to hide from the obligations of Article 1, the Senate's unique relationship with Article 3, or our role in equipping the powers of Article 2. Here, every debate over agriculture or infrastructure or education or taxes is downstream of the obligations of national security. Every question of policy here at home is contingent on our duty to provide for the common defense. One of the first times I spoke at length on this floor as a freshman, I was compelled to join the debate over strengthening the deterrence of America's nuclear triad. Whether to expand the U.S. military's hard target nuclear capability was an interesting question to pose to someone whose most recent job had been running a county government. But there, of course, was the founder's brilliance at work. The hopes and dreams of every American are tied up in our ability to protect and defend the nation and its interests. Every family traveling abroad and every worker and small business owner whose livelihood depends on foreign trade, they depend in turn on the credibility of America's commitments to friends and the strength of her threats to enemies. In turn, the safety and success of the men and women who volunteer to serve this great nation in uniform depend on the work we do here to ensure that enemies think twice before challenging them, and those enemies never face a fair fight. Thanks to Ronald Reagan's determination, the work of strengthening America's hard power was well underway when I arrived in the Senate. But since then, we've allowed that power to atrophy. And today, a dangerous world threatens to outpace the work of rebuilding it. So lest any of our colleagues still doubt my intentions for the remainder of my term, I have some unfinished business to attend to. In our work, most of us in this body develop an appreciation for the Senate itself, its written rules, its collegial norms, its pace of play. And yet so often I've watched colleagues depart venting their frustration at the confines of the institution or mourning what they perceive to be decline of its norms. regardless of the political storms that may wash over this chamber during the time I have remaining, I assure our colleagues that I will depart with great hope for the endurance of the Senate as an institution. There are any number of reasons for pessimism, but the strength of the Senate is not one of them. This chamber is still the haven where the political minority can require debate. It's still the crucible in which jurists are tested for their fidelity to upholding the Constitution and lives and laws as they were written. The Senate is still equipped for work of great consequence. And to the disappointment of my critics, I'm still here on the job. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator of North Carolina.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the members and staff and spectators in the gallery be allowed to applaud for a period not to exceed 30 seconds.
Is there objection?